The story begins with a gripping scene of two boxers locked in a fierce battle, the crowd roaring with excitement. At one moment, one of the fighters, clearly dominating the match, manages to pin his opponent down. Just then, a man who appears to be a high-ranking figure, a boss of some sort, shouts from the sidelines, urging the dominant fighter to finish his opponent. Without hesitation, the fighter snaps his opponent's neck, sending the already frenzied crowd into an even greater uproar. The scene then shifts to a martial arts training facility. Two young men, Steve and Frank, are seen preparing for a sparring session under the watchful eye of their coach, who is also revealed to be Steve's father. During the match, Steve dominates Frank with an intensity that blurs the line between a training exercise and a real fight. Steve shows no mercy, relentlessly attacking Frank and letting his emotions get the better of him. His arrogance peaks when he challenges the other students, boasting that he is the strongest among them. Steve's reckless behavior finally prompts his father to intervene. The coach, visibly frustrated, throws Steve to the ground and sternly warns him against acting out of control. The scene transitions, and we see Steve as a grown man, now enjoying a peaceful moment with his father and younger sister. In contrast, Joey, Steve's brother, is depicted as a family man with a wife and two children. Steve, who appears close to his nieces and nephews, spends time playing with them, showcasing a softer side to his character. Not long after, Joey and his father share a private conversation, one that seems to carry a weight of secrecy. Joey, who works as a police officer, reveals that the police department has been struggling with a series of unsettling cases involving unidentified bodies. These victims are found with severe bruising and injuries, leading authorities to suspect they are casualties of illegal underground fights, brawls that often result in fatal outcomes. Due to the gravity of the situation, Joey has been assigned to investigate the case, a task that carries significant risk and responsibility. Mike, the father of Steve and Joey, was deeply concerned about his son's involvement in such a dangerous mission. He even suggested that Joey decline the assignment, fearing the risks it posed. However, Joey, ambitious and driven in his career as a police officer, felt compelled to accept the task. To him, it was not just an assignment but a duty he couldn't refuse. His background in martial arts made him the ideal candidate to go undercover as a fighter in the illegal underground fighting scene, a fact that further solidified his resolve. Mike, who seemed to possess an almost instinctive understanding of the dangers his children faced, warned Joey to think carefully about the potential risks. He reminded Joey that he now had a family to consider, a wife and two children who depended on him. But Joey, determined and confident, brushed off his father's concerns. He assured Mike that he could handle the mission and would return safely. Reluctantly, Mike could only offer advice, urging his son to stay vigilant and cautious throughout the operation. The next day, Joey was briefed by his superiors on the details of his undercover mission. He was to follow a carefully crafted scenario, posing as an ordinary man desperate to become a fighter due to overwhelming debt. The plan was designed to help him infiltrate the underground fighting ring seamlessly. Despite the obvious dangers, Joey felt a surge of excitement, choosing to focus on the mission rather than the risks involved. As part of the operation, Joey partnered with Arnie, a former drug convict who was well acquainted with the underground world. Arnie had connections not only in the drug trade, but also in the chaotic and brutal realm of illegal fighting. Together, they approached Vincent, a key figure who could grant Joey access to the fighting arena. At Vincent's place, Arnie introduced Joey as Joni, a skilled fighter with a martial arts background who was now drowning in debt and seeking a way out. Vincent, intrigued by the introduction, agreed to schedule a fight for Joni as a test of his abilities. The day of the fight arrived. Joni, brimming with confidence, easily defeated his opponent, impressing everyone present. Arnie couldn't hide his pride, having brought such a formidable fighter to Vincent's attention. However, something unusual happened after the match. Another fighter approached Joni and warned him to be cautious of a man named Grips. According to the fighter, Grips was extremely dangerous and had taken a disliking to Joni's presence in the ring. Unbeknownst to them, this exchange was observed by a mysterious man who seemed intent on keeping his presence hidden. Later, as Joey returned home after his undercover mission, he was confronted by Steve, who had somehow discovered his brother's secret assignment. The two engaged in a heated argument. Steve accused Joey of being reckless, taking on such a dangerous mission without fully considering the consequences. He warned Joey that his actions could put not only himself, but also their family at risk. Once again, the warnings from his older brother fell on deaf ears. Joey remained steadfast in his decision, insisting that he was fully prepared to face the risks head-on. He expressed unwavering confidence in his ability to successfully complete the mission. In the end, Joey reassured Steve, urging him to stay calm and not to worry excessively about his safety. Not long after, Joey continued to fight as Joni and win match after match. His impressive winning streak only deepened Vincent's admiration for his new fighter. Joni, who had been excelling in his undercover role, approached Vincent to request another fight. However, this time, Vincent instructed him to throw the match and lose in the second round. The idea of intentionally losing didn't sit well with Joni, especially since he had been dominating every opponent he faced. Despite his reluctance, Joni had no choice but to obey Vincent's orders. After all, Vincent was the boss, and his fighters were expected to follow his commands without question. Reluctantly, Joni left the meeting and headed to the arena for the scheduled fight. During the match, Joni adhered to Vincent's instructions, deliberately holding back and allowing his opponent to dominate. In the end, the fight ended with Joni's defeat, much to the crowd's disappointment. What Joni didn't expect, however, was the sudden appearance of the mysterious man who had been tailing him earlier. The man was none other than Grips, Vincent's right-hand man. Grips revealed to Vincent that Joni was actually an undercover police officer, and that Arnie had been working with him to set him up. Vincent, who had always trusted Grips implicitly, immediately believed the accusation. Grips further claimed that he had obtained this information from a contact within the police department, adding credibility to his revelation. Without hesitation, Vincent confronted Joni after the fight. He coldly informed Joni that he needed to lose the match quickly so they could discuss his future in the underground fighting scene. Joni, unaware of the trap being set, complied and ended the fight as instructed. Exhausted from the match, Joni was unprepared for what came next. Vincent and Grips led him to a secluded location, far from the prying eyes of the crowd. There, in a chilling act of betrayal, Vincent shot Joni, ending his life abruptly and mercilessly. The next day, the news of Joey's death reached Mike when the police chief visited his home. During their conversation, it was revealed that Joey's superior at the police station was none other than Frank, the same man who had always been at odds with Steve and had been his rival in their martial arts class, as shown earlier in the film. Upon hearing about his son's death, Mike was overcome with grief, unable to accept the harsh reality. His heart ached even more as he recalled warning Joey against taking on such a dangerous mission. Steve, too, was devastated by the loss of his younger brother. He broke down in tears, the pain of Joey's death cutting deep. Steve couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Joey's death. He grew suspicious, questioning the circumstances surrounding his brother's assignment and the events that led to his tragic end. At the funeral, Mike, standing alone in his sorrow, was approached by Frank, who tried to offer words of comfort. Frank mentioned that the police had deployed a special team to arrest Arnie, the man who had allegedly led Joey into the dangerous world of underground fighting. Shortly after, Steve arrived, his face etched with suspicion as he glared at Frank. Without a word, he took his father away from the scene. On their way home, Steve expressed his disapproval of Mike for associating with Frank. However, Mike defended Frank, even bringing up an old incident where Steve had narrowly avoided a heavy prison sentence thanks to Frank's intervention. Frustrated by his father's accusations, Steve fired back, explaining that the altercation with the police chief's son had happened because he was trying to protect Joey at the time. Instead of understanding Steve's side, Mike continued to defend Frank, labeling Steve as the troublemaker who always caused chaos. He even went as far as saying that the tragedy that befell Joey should have happened to Steve instead. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Arnie met the same fate as Joey. As he was about to carry out his illegal dealings, Vincent confronted him and shot him without hesitation. As a result, the low-level drug dealer collapsed just as the police arrived on the scene. Back at home, Mike was trying to calm himself when Steve approached him with a determined look. Steve revealed his plan to avenge Joey's death his own way. Mike, terrified of losing his other son in the same manner, vehemently opposed the idea. But Steve's resolve was unshakable, and not even his father's pleas could deter him. All Mike could do was warn Steve to be cautious and not to recklessly dive into the dangerous world of underground fighting. Unlike Joey, who had entered the scene as a new fighter, Steve chose a different approach. He decided to make a name for himself first by stirring up trouble. His first move was to storm a bar frequented by a notorious biker gang, taking down its members one by one in a brutal display of strength. Coincidentally, Vincent was among the gang members present at the bar, setting the stage for a confrontation that would bring Steve closer to his goal of revenge. Witnessing Steve's display of raw brutality, Vincent approached him with an enticing offer. If Steve agreed to fight in the underground ring known as Raging Tiger, he would be handsomely rewarded. Shortly after, the two began to get acquainted, with Steve introducing himself as Sonny. What Steve didn't realize at first was that he was now face-to-face with the man responsible for Joey's death. The day Steve had been waiting for finally arrived. Unlike Joey, who had approached Vincent directly to offer himself as a fighter, Steve's method of making a name for himself had proven far more effective. His reputation had already spread through the underground fighting scene, earning him respect and even a touch of fear from Vincent. Impressed by Steve's skills and demeanor, Vincent introduced him to Santo Ariza, the powerful boss behind Raging Tiger. Santo had already heard stories about Sonny, the man who had single-handedly dismantled one of Vincent's biker gang hangouts. Santo was intrigued, even going so far as to offer Steve a lucrative deal, something he claimed was a rare opportunity. At that moment, Santo admitted that there was something unique about Sonny, a quality that not everyone possessed. Steve's rugged appearance and thug-like body language further convinced Santo of his potential. As a result, Santo placed a $10,000 bet on Sonny, confident in his abilities. In the ring, Steve, who was far more skilled in martial arts than Joey had been, easily dominated his opponents. His victories only deepened Vincent's trust in his new fighter. After one of his matches, Steve was approached by another fighter, the same bald-headed man who had once crossed paths with Joey. Surprisingly, the fighter revealed that he knew Sonny's true identity was Steve, but he promised to keep it a secret. The man introduced himself as Raymond and shared that he, too, had been drawn into the world of underground fighting for reasons of his own. From that moment on, Steve and Raymond grew closer. Their bond extended beyond the ring, with Raymond even introducing Sonny to his girlfriend, as if hoping to set them up. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Frank was growing increasingly frustrated. The discovery of another body covered in bruises added to the mounting pile of unsolved cases. The situation worsened when the media arrived, eager to cover the story. Frank, who had always carefully crafted a positive public image, was desperate to keep the news under wraps. He knew that any negative publicity could jeopardize his career. This incident highlighted Frank's relentless ambition and his willingness to protect his reputation at all costs. Back to Steve, he was now seen spending time with Raymond and his girlfriend, including Alicia, whom Raymond had promised to introduce to Steve a few days earlier. Unfortunately, the dinner gathering didn't go as warmly as expected. Sonny, who had been fighting relentlessly, was visibly exhausted, his energy drained from the constant battles. Seemingly wanting to lift his spirits and recharge the energy of the man she had just met, Alicia invited Sonny to her home. There, she offered him a soothing massage, a gesture that carried a hint of intimacy. For a brief moment, Steve found a semblance of comfort amidst the chaos of his double life. Meanwhile, Frank, who had been overwhelmed by the series of cases involving unidentified bodies, finally caught a break. It turned out that Arnie, who had been shot by Vincent, had survived. The police had arrived just in time to save him after the shooting. Now awake from his coma, Arnie agreed to testify, providing crucial evidence against Vincent. Without wasting any time, Frank and his team moved swiftly to raid Raging Tiger and apprehend Vincent. With Arnie's testimony as leverage, the police managed to arrest Vincent without resistance. The news of Vincent's capture spread quickly, but it didn't sit well with Santo, the powerful boss behind Raging Tiger. Santo was furious, his anger boiling over as he realized the extent of the trouble brewing around him. One of his henchmen, Victor, voiced his suspicions, suggesting that all the problems had started with the arrival of Sonny at Raging Tiger. Back at his father's place, Steve had only intended to visit Mike, but instead found Frank there. Mike and Frank appeared to be on friendly terms, with Frank casually mentioning that Vincent, the mastermind behind Joey's murder, had been arrested. At that moment, Frank advised Steve to stop his activities at Raging Tiger, arguing that the police had already taken down the main culprit. However, Steve wasn't satisfied. He believed that Vincent wasn't the only one involved in his brother's death. There were others still lurking in the shadows, profiting from the dirty business. The argument between Steve and Frank grew heated, but Steve's resolve was unshakable. He had come too far to stop now. Seeing that he couldn't dissuade Steve, Frank reluctantly asked for a few days' time. He pleaded with Steve to pause his actions, at least temporarily, so the police could gather enough evidence to arrest everyone involved in Raging Tiger. Upon hearing Frank's plea, Steve, who had initially been fiery and unyielding, began to soften. He agreed to pause his actions but left Frank with one request: to keep Raymond out of the police's dragnet. Steve emphasized that Raymond was the only decent person he had met in the brutal world of Raging Tiger, and he didn't want him caught in the crossfire. Unfortunately, Steve's meeting with Frank had been watched. Victor, one of Santo's henchmen, had been tailing Steve the entire time. Victor quickly reported his findings to Santo, who was already aware that Arnie had played a key role in Vincent's arrest by testifying to the police. Santo was furious, his patience wearing thin as the noose tightened around his operation. Meanwhile, Arnie, who was preparing to testify against Vincent in court, was hiding in a safe house. Accustomed to life on the streets, Arnie felt suffocated by the confinement. Against his better judgment, he decided to step out, hoping to visit his father. But fate had other plans. As soon as Arnie left the safe house, Victor ambushed him, gunning him down in cold blood. Arnie's death dealt a severe blow to the case against Vincent, who was subsequently released due to the lack of a key witness. When Frank delivered the news of Vincent's release to Steve, the latter's anger boiled over. Steve was now more determined than ever to take matters into his own hands. Surprisingly, Frank, who had always been at odds with Steve, finally agreed to support his former rival. The police chief even offered his assistance, acknowledging that Steve's methods might be the only way to bring Santo and his empire down. The two men formed an uneasy alliance, united by their shared goal of dismantling Raging Tiger. However, their plans hit a stop when Steve was ambushed by Victor outside his home. The attack left Steve unconscious, and when he woke up, he found himself bound and at the mercy of Santo. Santo, however, had no intention of killing Steve outright. Instead, the crime boss revealed a twisted plan. He wanted Steve to participate in a death match, a spectacle that would draw massive bets and fill Santo's coffers. Steve vehemently refused, even daring Santo to kill him on the spot. But Santo had anticipated this. To force Steve's compliance, he had taken Mike and Alicia hostage, threatening to harm them if Steve didn't obey. With no other choice, Steve reluctantly agreed to Santo's demands and entered the deadly fight. His first opponent was a formidable fighter named Fernando, known as the Spanish Conqueror. The difference in skill and Steve's battered condition left him struggling in the ring. Despite the odds, Steve managed to hold his own and emerge victorious. However, his win did little to please Santo, who seemed more interested in seeing Steve suffer than succeed. For his second fight, Steve was pitted against Raymond. Though both men initially refused to fight each other, they had no choice but to step into the ring. What followed was an unusual spectacle. Steve and Raymond staged a mock battle, their movements more reminiscent of a sparring session than a life-or-death struggle. Their lack of seriousness infuriated Santo, who abruptly halted the match. Determined to break Steve's spirit, Santo decided to throw him into the ring with Raging Tiger's most feared fighter, Creel, the Lord of War. The match between Steve and Creel was a brutal mismatch. Creel, a towering figure of raw power, shrugged off Steve's punches as if they were nothing. Steve was quickly overwhelmed, beaten to the point of unconsciousness. As he lay half-conscious, enduring Creel's relentless assault, Steve suddenly remembered the lessons his father, Mike, had taught him during their martial arts training. Drawing strength from those memories, Steve rose to his feet, battered and bloodied, but determined to fight back. This time, Steve changed his strategy. Instead of targeting Creel's upper body, he focused on his opponent's legs. Surprisingly, the tactic worked. Steve's precise strikes weakened Creel, eventually bringing the giant to his knees. The crowd, hungry for blood, roared for Steve to finish him, while Santo barked orders to one of his men to shoot Steve and end the fight. But before the trigger could be pulled, the police stormed the arena, led by Frank. Frank, who had been waiting for the right moment to strike, finally arrested Santo, thanks to the cooperation and sacrifices of Steve. With Santo in custody, Steve stood in the ring, his body broken but his spirit unyielding. He declared that he had avenged Joey's death right there in the ring, where he had fought not just for himself, but for justice. As the dust settled, Steve embraced Alicia, finding solace in her arms. Mike, proud of his son's courage and resilience, offered his congratulations and heartfelt praise. Moral lesson from the story: if you're going undercover as a fighter, don't win too much, it makes people suspicious. And remember, family dinners are less stressful than death matches, so maybe just stay home and eat pizza.